Good morning, good afternoon, more or less. Glad to be here for this session on participating on the Meda Week this year, organized by ASCAME, and in particular in this session that it's the starting point of the 19th edition of the New Africa Business Forum, organized by the European Institute of Mediterranean Studies and ASCAME and Chamber of Commerce. So also we are lucky to have with us very interesting actors in terms of economics, expert and institutional dimension that will enlighten us about so many challenges that we have in this African continent and more talking about his economic development. This year I'm first of all introducing myself. I'm Gemma Auvarell. I'm the head of Mediterranean strategy at the Catalan government here in Barcelona. And we are pleased to support this initiative and to support this edition because we are truly believing that what is the future of the African economy and Africa development will be also affecting our Mediterranean societies. And we are in this cross line of this Europe, Mediterranean and Africa reality, so we are very much committed from the Catalan government to support this kind of initiatives as we are part of this also for us. So this is why we developed some strategies, and we have a strategy for the Mediterranean on the 2030 and another plan for Africa that we are supporting a lot of initiatives and actions for with our public and private Catalan actors. So nice to be here, nice to have this opportunity, to have this exchange. In this kind of exercise, what is very difficult is to achieve some results after the discussion. So we will try to be clear, to be dynamic. We will do our best. We are lucky, as I told you, because the persons who are today with us are really experts on the matter. So they will help us not to explain a lot of things, but to go to the point, to the key ideas that we want to translate. And I think it will be useful if we try to just recap in 2 minutes what we are expecting of this session in particular. No? Today, in this edition, we are putting our accent in at least put into value what is not only the economic development, but also the part of the public and private actors dialogue, if I may say, creating spaces for accompanying this economic development in Africa. So also this year we are putting the accent in some, let me say, drivers of change. And in terms of actors, we need to talk about women, we can talk about young people for sure. And not as a rhetoric. We would like to make this reflection transversal in all our conversations. And there are 3 concepts that for us perhaps are interesting also to have in mind. The first is integration. We really think that, and this is why this initiative is put in place, that African economic integration is a first step to develop politics and to encourage actors to work better together. But this integration, let me say, at this moment, perhaps, and this is a question, no? Is in a kind of stuck somewhere between the negotiation and the implementation. We know for sure that this integrated free trade area will be the most important or the most larger free trade area in the world, and for dimensions, for persons involved, economically speaking. But it is in this moment, perhaps, that needs to be encouraged. So this is also a context that we need to take into consideration, and also the diversity of countries, the rich countries and poor countries in Africa, the diversities, the risk of the situation in Africa. All this is the context that we put in place and we want to underline in order to understand better how this dialogue, public and private, is taking place in this context of integration. But Africa, if Africa wants to play a key role as a stakeholder globally, needs also to take into consideration their regional environment. And this is why we provide, and we will count with really interesting persons today talking about this. And this is why Europe counts and Mediterranean counts and what is the difference between this North Africa having this Mediterranean approach and this Sub-Saharan Africa that is also there. So these 3 or 4 regions are talking together, and the coherence of all these regional strategies is also talking about how important is this integration and how difficult and how challenged we have. The second aspect is inclusion. We know how important is economic development, but we need and we expect also that this increase of welfare for all the societies can be managed in an inclusive manner. And this is why sustainability matters, and this is why women and gender matters. And there we also, we would like today also put in value how the private sector is not only creating jobs, but also is creating economies that can be sustainable in a medium and long term. No? And how also states and governments are implicated in this. And we will also be lucky to count with us with some governmental representatives that can also talk us about this. And the third is we are also expecting transformation. And to transform our economics and not to talk only about development, we need to talk about youth and about how we will encourage all these young people to be actively involved in the private sector and encouraging economies, in which way we can understand this as an added value and not only as a challenge or as a, may say, a problem. And also talking about digitalization, because we know how a lot of opportunities can be opened thanks to this idea. And also, and today we count with really persons that can explain to us about the value of the African diaspora, because this is, we say the number 6 region in Africa in somehow. So all these elements are here today on the plate, but don't worry, we will not tackle all this in this dimension, but it's just to contextualize what is the momentum of this debate. So we will start now with a short round of questions or interventions from our speakers. But first of all, we are lucky also to have the intervention of the key speaker of His Excellency Yehia El Wadhid. This is the first Undersecretary of the Ministry of Trade and Industry and head of the Egyptian Commercial Service. And this is because we truly believe that it's up to the states to improve the business environment, to enable the private sector to generate all this development. So Egypt is a key player in this context, and whatever is his politics, it seems to us really relevant at this stage. So, His Excellency Yehia El Wadhid, the floor is yours.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to extend my deep appreciation to the Association of the Mediterranean Chambers of Commerce and Industry, ASCAME, and the Barcelona Chamber of Commerce, Industry and Navigation on the well preparation of this event. And I would like also to say hi from Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27. It's a pleasure being with you today, and it's indeed an honor to be invited to deliver these words about main features of business ties and cooperation between Egypt and African countries. My address to you today will be focused on Egypt's economic cooperation with its African partners through 3 main pillars: bilateral economic cooperation, regional integration, and investments. But first, let me give you an overall idea or an overall view on our trade with Africa. Egypt's exports to Africa amounts to approximately $5 billion annually. Our exports to our African partners vary from heavy machinery to paper products. On a bilateral basis, Kenya has been historically Egypt's #1 trade partner. In 2021, the trade volume between Egypt and Kenya amounted to $638 million. South Africa is ranked #2 among our trade partners with total trade volume of $217 million US. Ladies and gentlemen, I will shed the light through the coming minutes on the main African regional economic communities that Egypt is a member of. First, Egypt is an active member in the Common Market for East and South Africa, COMESA. Established initially in 1981 as a preferential trade area, COMESA was turned into a common market treaty in 1994 with the aim of integrating its members through trade and development of natural human resources for the mutual benefits of all people in the region. COMESA members established a fully free trade area that grants goods originating from COMESA with 35% local component full exemption from customs duties. The FTA is considered as a step forward towards a customs union that guarantees the free movement of labor and capital and the eventual creation of a monetary union. Based on that, His Excellency Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, President of Egypt, launched the Egyptian COMESA chairmanship vision during the 21st COMESA summit that was held in Egypt on November 23rd last year. The Egyptian vision has been texted under the theme of deepening businesses' integration to accelerate the economic recovery from the negative effects of COVID-19. As Egypt believes that encouraging the businesses in our region plays a vital role to accelerate COMESA region economic recovery. One of the most important pillars in Egypt's chairmanship vision is to encourage intra-investment movements in COMESA region. So Egypt, in collaboration with COMESA Secretariat and COMESA Regional Investment Agency, are discussing the arrangements of holding the first COMESA Intra-Investment Forum in Egypt in the near future. Second, we have another agreement, which is the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement. In 2015, member states of COMESA, along with member states of the East African Community, EAC, and the South African Development Community, SADC, decided to create the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement, TFTA, to integrate the three major economic communities in East and South Africa region into a single market. These three blocks have designed a plan through which their communities are to become one free trade area, liberalizing trades among their member states in goods and services, and solving the problem of overlapping membership among their communities. This area is one of the largest trade blocs in all Africa. It includes 26 countries whose GDP comprises over 60% of Africa's GDP and a market of 640 million consumers. These numbers represent a significantly large market by all standards and place the tripartite in the 16th place in terms of the size of the economy compared to the world. Finally, the African Continental Free Trade Area. Negotiations on the tripartite FTA have been launched in parallel to the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has been launched by the African Union in the same year, 2015. The African Continental Free Trade Area comprises the 54 member states of the African Union and has laid down a relatively more ambitious integration plan than the tripartite. It's worth noting that a recent study by the World Bank estimates that when implemented effectively by 2035, this FTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, is set to lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty and 70 million Africans from moderate poverty. Today, I think it's safe to say that after a few years of negotiations, we are now getting much closer to taking the African Continental Free Trade Area out of the treaty text into the lives of African people. But as we do so, we must ensure that this FTA is inclusive to all of us in Africa and a successful enabler to shared growth across the continent, take stock of and identify ways to further enhance our bilateral relations. Ladies and gentlemen, the preferential treatment that Egypt enjoys within regional economic communities in Africa is a great source of attraction for FDI to use Egypt as a hub to produce and export to its African partners. It is also worth emphasizing that we strongly support the initiatives of increasing the number of the Egyptian investments projects in Africa. And I would like to mention that His Excellency Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, President of Egypt, has given special instructions to strengthen the presence of Egyptian companies in all African markets through trade and investment. In addition, providing building capacity programs to help African countries to enhance their abilities in all necessary fields. Ladies and gentlemen, Egypt is committed to Africa and pledges to boost investment and cooperation with African countries by strengthening regional ties and strengthening economic integration across the continent. It is also worth mentioning that there are no doubts that regional investment movement plays a crucial role in African economic integration, and organizing such an important events will help us sharing the experiences in encouraging national and regional investment. It will also offer a platform to introduce practical solutions for the private sector to encourage investments and the investment movement between our African countries. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I'm delighted to be with you today to address this important gathering and to give you a quick view about the acceleration of cooperation between Egypt and the African countries in terms of economic and trade-related issues. Thank you for your kind attention, and I wish you a successful, fruitful event, and again, wish to see you in Sharm el-Sheikh next time.
Thank you. Inshallah, we can be in Sharm el-Sheikh next time. Now we are lucky to be also in Barcelona, and I think it has a fantastic example of public commitment that was Egypt on this area. The importance of the integration for the movements also in terms of bilateral movements, how important, and also Egypt presented as a hub in the African reality. So this done very well for our next and first, if I may say, speaker of the round table, Mrs. Dalia Tadros, that she is Assistant Minister for Technical Affairs and Follow-up in the Ministry of Public Business Sector in the government of Egypt. And Mrs. Tadros, exactly is our question to you is why Egypt can be this hub in terms of industrial activity location, for example. That is one of the main objectives of your government here. You have the floor.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'd like to thank the organizers for having me among this distinguished panel. Send regards to my ex-colleague, Dr. Yahya Al-Wasaq. Just an example of the public-private partnership that you earlier mentioned in your kind introduction. I'm personally an example of this partnership because I just moved from being a civil servant at the Ministry of Public Enterprise to the private sector, which shows really the flow of calibers between the public and private partnership, and accordingly sharing the views of both sides and being understanding of the other side of the table would really add value and enhance this kind of cooperation. So just an introduction shedding light on the kind of and the strength of the partnership between the public and private partnership parties in Egypt. This is just one example, but the flow of calibers, but definitely the amount of projects and the development that is happening in Egypt and also beyond the boundaries of Egypt in sister African countries is huge. Examples of which I now move to the private sector, working for an industrial development company that so much would invest on the strength of the bilateral and multilateral agreement that Dr. Yahya has shed light on, to extend its activity to develop industrial parks to African countries, to add value to the natural resources of the continent, and accordingly it enhance an inclusive growth to those countries, but also create jobs to its population and have sustainable growth in these countries. So industrial development really is the next step after enhanced trade between African countries, as we believe it would add to the sustainable growth, the inclusion of different categories. It's a continent that is really very much rich in its natural resources that need to be processed in their countries, not exported in raw form, and accordingly create values to the enhance the value chain of these products or raw materials, but also create jobs to the women and youth. And the continent is really rich in its the youth of its population. So I think this is how industrial activity would flow after enhanced trade and accordingly create value to the wealth of natural resources of the continent.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Tatros. I think you provide us a very nice reflection of how competitiveness start by this industrial attraction and how Egypt can take advantage of all these strategies. So thank you very much. And after this in deep in what the Egypt strategy, we go to the European and Euro-Mediterranean frame. We have with us Mr. Ioannis Bardakastanis. Mr. Bardakastanis, he's president of the Euromed Follow-up Committee in the Economic and Social Council in the European Commission, and he's in charge of the following precisely this European neighborhood policy in terms of the Economic and Social Council. So what is interesting also to us is that, I don't know, Mr. Bardakastakis, you know that next week we will have here the ministerial, the Euro-Mediterranean and the UFM ministerial. So we talk at the introduction about how important it is to take advantage of this regional and sub-regional situation, the European politics in Africa, the Euromed experience in this dialogue between European councils and economic and social councils. What do you think about how this can be useful for this dialogue with our European African reflection?
First of all, I would like to thank for the invitation on behalf of the European Economic and Social Committee. We have put high priority in the European Economic and Social Committee in the relations between and among social economic councils and similar institutions in the Euro-Mediterranean region. Every year, we organize the Euromed Summit, gathering from all countries around the Mediterranean representatives. This year it was held at the end of May, beginning of June in Marrakesh. And next year we are working with the Egyptian government and the Bibliotheca Alexandrina to organize it in Egypt in November 2023. Africa is a very high priority for the European Union as a whole. And I would like to share with you just a few points of the package that was published earlier this year by the European Commission. It's the EU-Africa Global Gateway Investment Package, offering 150 billion euros in investment. The package recognizes the digital challenges facing African citizens and aims to secure digital connectivity between Europe and Africa and within Africa itself. Initiatives of the package include supporting construction of networks of fiber optic cables across sub-Saharan African countries, helping bridge connectivity gaps between coastal and landlocked countries. It's Africa-Europe Digital Innovation Bridge aims to promote intercontinental cooperation between stakeholders in Africa and Europe and facilitate the launch of a scale-up of innovative African startups and SMEs. Finally, the European Secure Satellite Communications Program will provide internet connectivity to the most remote regions and contribute to fairer broadband distribution. Therefore, with the help of this global gateway, public and private stakeholders can work more closely together and to think strategically about digital priorities across African regions. For example, public-private partnerships can be a very smart way to ensure to private companies to expand in remote areas as they have done in urban, with the right infrastructure in place and harnessing the capabilities of its local citizens. Africa can begin to keep up with its digital momentum. The race for digital advantage in Africa has already begun. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this good indeed also about the commitment of Europe with this strategy for Africa in terms of digital and connection to help to the private actors. It seems to us that this is one of the main challenges. So this idea that this commitment from the European Union with this plan, with this idea of internet and digital connections can be really useful for private sectors and public economies. Thank you, Mr. Bardasakis. And now we have Mr. Mohder Kanfir. He's Governance and Public Policy Advisor, Head of Tunisia African Business Council think tank, And we are pleased to have you here today because you have a strong background in business consulting, digital transformation, and investment advisory. So what do you think it's the place for this private sector in this integration economic that we are talking now so far?
First of all, thank you for having me in this panel and in this event, in this place, Barcelona. The regional integration is a very old paradigm. The regional integration by trade, not by war. By war is also another story, but we are here talking about the integration by trade. Carthaginians came here to open or to set up agencies for trade. So the process of Barcelona maybe started before 3 centuries before Christ. And it failed for different reasons. I don't have time to discuss that. And in 1995, we restarted with the process started from north, okay? The integration process as initiative, European initiative. So the result is more or less, let's say, disappointing in terms of maybe sharing wealth, but we still have hope. Now, in Africa, we have some other challenges. We have 54 countries, right? And the 55th is virtual, is the diaspora. We have big, maybe, population of Africans outside the borders, outside the continent, and they are playing a big role. So if we want to bridge and if we want to accelerate, they will probably have to play a major role. And they are in the private side, they're in the private sector side. And they are willing to invest, and unless they find the business environment for this. And they also need infrastructure. I will not talk about only the hardware, but they need also economical and political institutions playing their role in their homelands, and also in terms of, let's say, trans-border or cross-border infrastructure corridors. Traditionally, Africa, the trade in Africa is extraverted. That means that the commerce is getting from the continent outside the continent. For 85% of the trade is through ports, and it's mainly raw material. And African countries are importing, of course, equipments, cars, etc. Now, they think the integration, we have to deal with different economic models, and also probably different contingencies. First, maybe challenge Africa has to address is how to feed local population, how to educate local population, how to ensure a minimum of health to the local population. And this is basic services, basic social services. And if integration there is, and if partnership between Europe and Africa could be maybe motivating, is if we can address these challenges together. And we have a lot of content, a lot of facilities that could be oriented through new channels like internet to help less favored populations in Africa. And I think this is the first layer of the integration. So social integration, without forgetting the cultural also integration. Because what happens, and this is, I'm an observer of different countries in Africa. Usually people in Africa, they don't know too much about other people in Africa. They know more about what happens in the world, in the United States, in Europe, and less what's happening in the country just beside. So melting all these things together, we can produce a minimum of awareness of the potential of the African people, African population. And from there, of course, the states have a role, the public sector have a role, the public sector also have another role, and we have to take advantage of the experience that happened in some places, and I think European Union could show a good example in some, not 100% well, but in some areas, European Union has succeeded to really accelerate the social progress, and where the social progress we have to take, let's say, to be inspired by this experience, and it remains work on how to set up institutions, performing institutions. This is very important, and this is, I think, key to succeed in the African integration.
Good. I think you tackled the question of governance at the end, and this is important, no? And social, in fact, social development. And now this came very well for the next speaker, talking about this social inclusion that we need for this good health economic development that we need in the continent. So, Mrs. Shamira Lukomwa, Strategic Partnership Manager of the African Visionary Fund, you have a large experience in working on this from this perspective. So we will be delighted to understand how do you see the main challenge to construct this inclusive vision and this new vision for Africa.
Sure, and thank you for the introduction, Gemma, and thank you to the Meta Week organizers for hosting today's discussion. I think before kind of going into your question, I'd really like to just give an overview of the African Visionary Fund. Our mission is to drive more funding to African-founded and African-led nonprofits and social enterprises to accelerate their impact. Since our launch in 2020, so we're still a pretty new organization, we have committed over $2.5 million in grant funding to 15 African-led social impact organizations across 9 sub-Saharan African countries, with the overall goal of driving over $50 million in catalytic resources to African social innovators by 2030. And we are laser focused on funding African social innovators because across the board, whether you're looking at the private sector or social impact sector, foreign and foreign-led organizations operating in Africa receive the lion's share of resources at the expense of African-led organizations, often due to flawed power dynamics and implicit bias. And I just want to share 2 statistics that I think really bring this into perspective. Less than 1% of all international humanitarian funding goes to African-led nonprofits. And then even of the top 10 African-based startups that received the highest amount of venture capital in Africa last year, only 2 were African-led. And so when we think about kind of how the social impact sector is contributing to business and socioeconomic development in Africa, we really need to be focusing and drilling down on social impact organizations and actors that are African-led. And I know that today's topic, we're talking about, youth job creation, women empowerment, and digital innovation. And even from our portfolio of just 15 organizations, I can give you a ton of examples as to how the social impact sector and how those organizations illustrate how the sector, the African social impact sector, is moving the needle and advancing economic growth and business development from the root. But I think just to open up, I'll start with just one example of how the social sector is bridging the gap between government and the private sector. So as my panelists have mentioned, we've been talking a bit about the youth demographic dividend, digital connectivity, and the importance of kind of filling skills gaps in order to actually ensure that there are opportunities for African youth, for African professionals. we're seeing that many governments are shifting the policy environment towards a digital economic transformation. And there are thousands of examples of social impact organizations like our partner Fundibots in Uganda that are working in tandem to modernize and expand access to STEM education and e-learning, particularly for women and girls who are often left behind, particularly in this field. And Fundibots is revolutionizing Uganda's science and education by providing hands-on robotics and STEM training that gets students excited about STEM and opens greater opportunities for youth in the tech sector. So since 2016, they have partnered with over 200 schools in Uganda. They've reached 20,000 students and even trained 400 teachers on how to better teach science. And Fundibots provides youth with the technical skills needed for a digital future, and they're also radically transforming Uganda's future business landscape and economy by training its future workforce today. And so I think an important thing just to note is that there is a role for collaboration across all of our sectors, and that social impact organizations are really helping to kind of get to move the needle on these development issues that we're discussing today.
Thank you very much. I think that we always think in terms of, I don't know, public, private, and then also some sectors like agricultural sector, manufacturing sector, industrial sector, but we are not too used to talk in terms of social impact organizations and their impact in providing this kind of bridge between public and private, if I may say, and how important it is for this towards the inclusive society that we, so some questions that we can take for the debate. I don't know if it's online, Mr. Nochu. Is he online, ready to speak, or I don't see him in the screen? He's not online? He's not connected? No? Well, so, yes, I'm sorry. Now I'm seeing you in the screen. Okay, so we pass the last word for this fourth round to Mr. Hugh Nochu. He is founder and head of the Public Policy in Africa initiative. And I think it's very good that you are taking the floor now in this last approach, because your extremely interesting experience talking about a little bit about this the need of this circular economy approach, if I may say, and also the need that has also this word appears here of governance for all these challenges that we need in public and private dimension and development. So the floor is yours. Now that we can see.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you to ASCAME. And thank you also to the Barcelona Chamber of Commerce for this opportunity. Thank you for the support team who have been emailing us, inviting us. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here today. I am founder of the Public Policy in Africa initiative. Before I answer your question, just a little bit about what we do. We develop alternatives to existing policies in Africa, in part because, Africa represents less than 1% of global research output. So most of the decision of policy in Africa are based on intuition, personal experience, and dogma. So we need to, develop alternatives that are based on science. So also what we do, because science show that, the youth is the future of Africa. Is Africa's greatest potential, along with our natural resources, along with, for example, our tourism potential. So evidence suggests that, our youth need two skills to succeed within the next 2 decades. One is coding, and the other one is emotional intelligence. So what we do at the Public Policy in Africa initiative is that we train the young African how to code for free using Python. We also have, a leadership academy, which is emotional intelligence. So this is our little contribution to the renaissance of Africa. To answer your question, there are a lot of opportunities in Africa, but something that must be said is that, the key to unlock these opportunities is the private sector. and government should play a key role, in unlocking the potential of the African private sector. For example, by addressing our structural problem related to our infrastructure. We still have a lot of untapped road, which, increase the cost of business, transportation costs, for example. Talking about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which allow us to freely trade across the whole African continent. Government should also help the private sector by addressing the electricity crisis in Africa. You have about 600 million people still, having not access to affordable and clean energy. And the last structural problem that the government should address to help the private sector in Africa is to try and fix, the problem related to our education, because there is a mismatch between the labor market need and the educational offer. Besides that, it's important to say that there's a lot of opportunity in Africa. The African Continental Free Trade Area offers a huge opportunity, already discussed by some of my co-panelists. But what I want to say is that at the moment, inter-Africa trade represents about 16% of our export in Africa. That's so small, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or area, we hope to go past 50%. It's important also to know that Africa trade among themselves mostly manufacture goods. This is so important in terms of business opportunities in Africa. So because they trade among themselves mostly manufacture goods, it's important also to think about industry. How can the government do to unleash the potential of the African industry? And I speak about the food manufacturing industry. For example, you have opportunity in the fishery, have opportunity in so many foods. Africa have about 60% of world unused Arab land. Talking about agriculture, we currently facing a food security crisis in the world with the war in Ukraine. This may be an opportunity to invest in Africa, who have 60% of world unused Arab land. So there's a lot of opportunity in Africa, but the private sector should be put at the center of the economy, and to unleash the potential of the private sector, the government in Africa should try and solve some of our structural problems related to quality education, related to electricity, and related to infrastructure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, because you tackled something that still was there on the air, but you concretize in some priorities and how to manage in this challenge that we have. Okay, so we have a lot of the open windows here for discussions. Let's concentrate a little bit in, I will provide you with 3 ideas of questions, and you can choose more or less. And as we told you at the beginning, we are very much interested to understand the challenge of this integration that is there, but how to do to provide some elements. You speak a lot about the potentials of this integrated space. So we understand, all of us, we agree on that will be an added value. So now one of the questions is, do you think that really private and public, social dimension, governance, whatever, but public and private are really working together towards this integration? Do you consider that this model of integrative economy that we have on mind from regional perspective, Europe, Euro-Mediterranean, but also the Africa trade area, are providing this space for dialogue between public and private? We have here nice examples of governments like the Egyptian one providing a lot of let me say, importance to this integration, putting in place some measures. You are talking also of some initiatives coming from organizations. Do you consider that this integration model is doing this, creating this space for public and private really dialogue? And for example, in this case, which priorities? No? Which priorities do you consider can be really important? Another, as I told you at the beginning, youth and gender. So let's talk about why women now, they have been, it is increased their presence, and mainly in leadership, in enterprises, in the private and public sphere, overall in the world, but also in Africa. But still, labor market, still education, still what is the normal, let me say, inclusion of a woman in the economies is a challenge. How do you consider in this long or medium path of this African model of development, what is the place of woman, or how do you consider that this can be, or how do you consider should be done on this regard? No? So let's start with this idea of public-private and how we can do this, and also let me also to introduce the question of youth, because youth, as we are talking about, it's the hope of the continent, but at the least, but for example, if young people in Africa now is really searching, because there is a question of job problem, no? So they are now activating business enterprises, but in the informal sector mainly. How do you consider, for example, that it can be a kind of help for these young people trying to be active because job is not there, and in this private dimension, how can we integrate this informal dynamism inside the politics inside? 3 questions you can choose, and we can just start to finalize this reflection with some ideas, and we will really appreciate, I think, also the public here, some fresh ideas that you can help us to understand better some possibilities. So, Mrs. Tadros, you are here. You can start if you want.
Thank you very much. I'll just pick the first question because it's really very interesting, the relationship between the private and the public parties and the partnership between them to maximize the growth and or the inclusive growth and account for also women and youth. And I would say here, it's a learning curve. Since a couple of decades, we had a public-private partnership unit at one of the most important economic group ministries in Egypt. And different models have been tried and suggested by both parties, starting from privatization of state-owned entities to supply chain relations to operation and management. And I tend to say it is a kind of a supply and demand relationship where even if they start very far, their interests converge until they reach a common ground on the kind of partnership or the model of partnership that can take place between them. And I would also add to this that it's also a case-by-case basis. Whatever model works for one project does not work for another. For example, I'll pick here 2 examples. The huge amount of infrastructure development that has taken place in Egypt over the past 5 to 6 years has been maybe managed by state-owned or state-related entities like the Ministry of Housing or the Ministry of Transport. But the tenders of the implementation have been offered to the private sector. So this is one kind of partnership whereby you tender the implementation of roads that is managed and the urban planning is being done by the public sector, but the execution is being implemented by private construction companies. One other thing is the running of the industrial parks where a lot of opportunities arise for the private sector, small and medium enterprises, to start and run and grow their businesses in different sectors. So this was offered first for the private sector. Now the public sector is implementing or installing industrial parks and industrial zones, but again, offering the operation of them and the running of them for the private sector, which has developed know-how in running those industrial parks and offering business support services to SMEs, which again feeds in the youth area, because these are large private sector industrial developers, but they are developing industrial parks that meet the needs of small and medium enterprises coming from the very rich pool of incubators and accelerators that give chances to the youth to come from the informal sector and join the formal sector and start to grow their businesses through the rich opportunity of not only knowledge exchange arising from being in an industrial park that is rich with different private sector players, but also the supply chain relations that can arise from being in an industrial community, if you want to call it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really, really a lot of things you tell us. That's for another debate, but very interesting in order to show how important it is this relation, and how it could be a very important issue to think about how to manage that. Thank you very much. So now, Mr. Bardakastanis, do you want to?
I will take the public and private also.
Oh, very good.
But I will have a comment also for youth and women, and I will add also persons with disabilities, since I come from the sector.
Okay.
So far, Africa's development has been characterized largely, as already said, by our uncoordinated initiatives, political conflicts, and low levels of regional trade. The European Economic and Social Committee recognizes the value of long-term investment in infrastructure in Africa. This will foster regional value chains and sustainable local economy that is ecologically viable, that is and economically sustainable, and produces production capabilities, including local quality jobs. An approach geared solely towards overseas exports is unsustainable. In particular, intercontinental economic cooperation should favor local production in Africa. Those main sectors should be sustainable and supported and be favored: agriculture, energy, and circular economy, as well as raw materials and construction. Overall, African integration can provide wider regional markets, opening more opportunities for African producers and consumers beyond the smaller markets that might exist within their own borders. It can reduce the cost of developing infrastructure, including transport, communications, energy, water systems, and specific research, which can prove more expensive for one individual country. In order to achieve and maximize their potential, African economies need to improve their public institutions and infrastructure, deepen regional integration, and provide their citizens with quality education. I stop here.
Fantastic. Bueno, you tell us whatever to do in the coming 10 years. Thank you very much, because it's plenty of ideas about priorities and how integration is useful for that.
But if I may make one sentence for women and youth and persons with disabilities.
Of course.
Development that is not for all is not inclusive. And therefore, the development and the growth in the continent should provide opportunities and inclusion for women, of course, for young people and for persons with disabilities across the continent.
Thank you very much. This is a very good statement and a very nice objective of this recommendation for the session.
Yes,
It's your turn.
I'll start with this statement, and I do agree. We at Tunisia Africa Business Council advocate for a universal access to internet in Africa. But this is a huge investment. This requires a huge investment. Because if you want to make the services like education, health, e-health, public services at the reach of everyone, you should tackle the problem of the digital divide. And I think that technology is ready to be to give solutions to the coverage and to 100% coverage in the continent. But this requires sponsorship. This requires also for funds. We need to fund this infrastructure. It could be handled by the government at the first stage, and then we have to think how to build up some, let's say, companies or business models around this infrastructure to enable the return on investment. And from there, we will see a true change. Now, I don't think there is a will to generalize internet to least favored population in Africa, because it's also a story of private sector interest. The private sector, the role of private sector is not to provide services for free, and we know that. So how to make a deal with the private sector to engage in that direction? This requires some kind of incentives, or maybe a new repartition of the wealth, and someone should pay. Someone should pay for that. And from, let's say, the different sources, we can think about blended finance, for instance, that could initiate this kind of experience in some places. And if we see successful, let's say, microcosm that could emerge from that, we can generalize. Now, getting back to the collaboration and cooperation between the public and private sector. Usually, public and private relationship is based on mistrust in Africa. Okay, and this mistrust is even between public and public, and between private and private. The mistrust is something very common because there is a failure in the role of the governments, all the governments in Africa, all. They don't manage very well the information data. Data is a public service, and we have a huge delay to catch up in this area. We have to provide data and to protect personal data and to give the public information, and we have to structure that. I didn't meet anyone, any government working seriously on that subject with the budget that is required. It's a huge project. But every time we discuss that in some places, okay, we know that we need to structure the information to protect the personal data and to give it as a public service, but no one is putting that in the policy. Information should be the top priority if we want to integrate the new era and integrate technology. So this is a prerequisite for all the story we are saying now. So we can elaborate on this, but I just would like to give the floor to my colleagues to also bring some ideas on that subject.
Thank you, because open governance is really a key issue, even in here, no? In Europe, for example. I can imagine that to deal all this on Africa, it's also...
The gap is bigger.
The gap is bigger. Yeah. Very important point.
Yes. Well, I'd like to provide some comments about, gender inclusion and one of the questions that you posed earlier. Would also like to echo that I really loved that comment. Development that's not for all of us is not inclusive. And I think when it comes to gender specifically, we have 54 countries with very varying degrees of like gender inclusion, whether that's at the government level, private sector, just you know, in the day-to-day kind of lives. And so it's hard, like there perhaps are themes across the continent, but it really is important to also dive into at a country-specific level to really understand the context. But I think one thing that is perhaps a theme across the continent is really like this urban-rural divide. And I think where you see that, whether it's like investment or kind of interest or excitement around, whether it's like investments and even just like promoting gender inclusion, sometimes is concentrated in urban areas, whereas rural areas are often maybe not a high priority for some. And so I think I'd like to just kind of comment on how even like the social sector is really working to empower women at the grassroots level, which I think is really integral if we really want to make lasting kind of social change. And so an example I can kind of share is one of our partners, Kidame Mart, is Ethiopia's largest kind of last mile distribution network. And so they empower rural women, entrepreneurs to provide last mile distribution of fast moving consumer goods that enhance people's standard of living. And so it's a for-profit business model. So even though it does have that social scope, they are, you know, taking an innovative and market-driven approach to create long-term and meaningful change for the women micro-entrepreneurs that they recruit and train, while also bridging the gap between consumer goods suppliers and rural communities, which is often, you know, that last mile distribution is often challenging, not just with consumer goods, but also with health delivery, education, et cetera. And so Kidame Mart has increased like the average income of the 3,000 women entrepreneurs that they work with by an average 36%. You know, served over 100 rural communities in Ethiopia and provided 1.5 million customers with high quality products faster and at lower costs. And so Kidame Mart is an illustration of how investments into innovative and alternative business models can bridge service delivery gaps and advance gender equality, improve livelihoods, and help grow direct-to-consumer business. So,
I might add also ready for transformation, because if we don't do this approach, we will never go a step further for transforming. That is what we are talking about. So thank you, very, very interesting indeed. And now to finalize and wrap up, because I think it's now time, it's your turn, Mr. Kochu. I'm sorry, the name.
Thank
Yes.
you. No, that's okay. It's
Try to
that's
pronounce,
okay.
imagine, Kuchu. Okay.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your question. I think question number 3 is so important, especially within the African context. I will try and answer that first. You know, I told you earlier on that our greatest potential in Africa is our youth. 60% of our population are aged 25 years old or less. 80% are aged 35 years old or less. In some countries in Africa, you have more than 50% of the population aged 15-year-old or less. So women also play a key part in our African development. I think to unleash the potential or to empower women in Africa and young people in Africa, there's only one word: education, quality education. When I speak of quality education, what I mean by that is we should make sure to encourage women and young people to, you know, to embark onto science, engineering, technology, and mathematics, because Africa should develop its industry sector. Africa should power its economy through innovation. We should also discriminate when it comes to giving bursary to women and young people, because how will we develop Africa sustainably if we don't measure? And how will we measure without data? It's important to place education, quality education, and research at the center of it all. When it's come to how can we as Africa empower our beloved women? How can we as African empower our young people? Aside from education and also encouraging and giving bursary to women and young people, you know, to embark on research focusing on STEM, there's also an area where we need to focus on when it comes to empowering women. I think my colleague, my colleague on the panel has mentioned it already. It's called, you know, making sure women-led businesses have access to credit, you know, especially when it's come to scaling up their business by acquiring more, you know, machinery. We should make sure that, you know, those women enterprises in Africa on the continent, which are doing good, but just need some funding to scale up their business, to acquire some machines, that they have access to funding. These are very important. Now, concerning your first question, when it's come to public-private partnerships in Africa, there is one specific area that I want to discuss, which is the fact that in Africa, you know, there are a lot of facilities put in place by the government or the private sector to improve the business environment, but most of the private sector actors are not even aware of it. So I think that communication is key, making sure private sector is aware of everything that the government has put in place to ease their business, to ease their activity, to unleash their potential. This is very important. Some people spoke about one-stop shop. Some countries have put it in place, but other countries haven't put it in place yet, where you have within one single building, all the key person within all the ministry department within a government that can help a private actor acquire, you know, a project, infrastructure project license, for example. So this is so important to make sure that, you know, all those facilities the private sector are aware of. We talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area. Many companies in Africa I talk to at the moment are not aware of what should be done to trade under the African Continental Free Trade at the moment. There are work that the government are putting in place, but they are not aware of. For example, where should they go to acquire the necessary license? With authority issuance license that gives your product, you know, the right to being sold all over across Africa. So things like that. So thank you so much for your question.
Thank you very much. You tackle always this idea of that we start here about open governance, open information, and sometimes coming to the role of facilitators for the public to the private. It's also a basic role, is facilitate these spaces, this information, and through these instruments, no? Well, time to wrap up because we are very late, even for the Mediterranean culture and the African one. This is 2:30. And I think, thank you very much. It was really a challenge because a lot of issues for so important matter, but you touch and you provide, I think, a good sample of main and major challenges facing for our goal, that is to help to understand and to contribute for this development in the Africa continent. And what I like a lot is this public-private dialogue insists from a lot of you in taking into consideration a lot of social challenge. So why not we can a little bit finish all this, such education or women, youth, and also in disabilities, but also how to make this model capable to work on this such a challenging space, if I may say. We can finish perhaps saying that we are in phase of perhaps a new model to be done. Perhaps it is an opportunity to bring a space in Africa for not only inclusive, open, circular economy, but also new models that can enlighten our global challenge, because in fact it is a global challenge what we are talking about, but plenty of possibilities. So thank you for opening our eyes to all these interesting questions, and thank you for the audience for your patience at this time. And okay, thank you very much, and we can close here this nice round table.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.